Welcome to Goobertown Hobbies. My name is Brent. You may have heard that paint can be ruined if it freezes, and yeah, it can be. Some people avoid buying paint during the winter to reduce chances that it'll freeze in a delivery truck or on the front porch. I've heard of paint getting skunked and trashed this way, but I've been lucky and I've never seen it for myself. In this video, we're going to put paint through some freeze-thaw cycles, and we're going to see how bad this problem actually is. We'll also talk to a paint manufacturer who had to face this issue head-on. Here's the experiment. I made myself a paint set from a variety of paint brands: Citadel, Army Painter, Vallejo, Two Thin Coats, and Pro Acryl. I got a baseline for these bottles by painting a handful of minis from Arcadia Quest. There were no surprises here. The paints worked well. I was just checking to make sure that everything was in good working condition. I wanted to get some footage of the paint moving around and behaving nicely before I tried to mess things up. This experiment is not meant to be a brand comparison. These are assorted bottles that I pulled from my collection. They're different ages and different colors, and it's possible that some of them have already gone through a freeze-thaw cycle or two before I ever got them. We're casting a wide net. I picked a variety of paint in the hopes that we'd get at least one bottle to really degrade so that we can see what's going on. Enough chitter-chatter, let's throw these out in the cold. I'm doing this experiment in Maine in January. I left them out for a full night of the bitter cold, and then I took the paints back inside in the morning. Most of the bottles were rock hard. These are solid. The exception were the two bottles of Vallejo Game Color. These bottles were still squeezable, and the paint inside was still fluid. This paint is very cold, but it's still paint. I opened up some of the other bottles to look at the frozen paint. It'll be interesting to see if these paints still work when they thaw out. The solids all had a slightly different look. P3 and Pro Acryl kinda had solid blocks that took the shape of the container, while the Citadel paints had a granular, sludgy appearance. The Citadel paint slush can move around a bit, but it's definitely not what we started with. Okay, now let's let everything warm up to room temperature. After the paints were warm, I did a thorough job of mixing them with a paint vortex and with shaking. I noticed that the mixing balls weren't moving around in the Army Painter green, so I tried putting some paint on the palette. And yeah, there's definitely something wrong here. I popped the nipple off and started pulling out these pellets of solid green gunk. This is room temperature, but it is not paint anymore. Wowza, look at that. This is not good. The metallic silver from the Army Painter survived, and so did every other bottle of paint. I used the surviving colors and I painted up another model from Arcadia Quest, and yeah, the paints are still working as well as they did before the freeze. This paint job is no better and no worse than the original benchmarks. Everything survived the first freeze. Everything except this green skin from Army Painter Fanatic. I cut the bottle open to take a look, and yeah, this is toast. It's kinda like a crumbly sponge that has soaked up all of the liquid from the carrier. This green paint was fine yesterday, but after a freeze, it is complete junk. To continue stress testing the survivors, I hit them with multiple freeze-thaw cycles. For consistency, I switched to using my freezer in the kitchen, which is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 17 degrees Celsius. The second freeze looked a lot like the first freeze, and the second thaw looked a lot like the first thaw. Most of the paints solidified in the cold, while the two bottles of Vallejo Game Color stayed fluid. Everything was warmed up and shaken up, and yeah, it looks like we still have a working paint kit. I've heard that some paints can survive a couple of freezes, but they start taking serious damage after that, so we're going to keep going with more cold cycles. After a third freeze and thaw, it was time to test the paint again by painting another mini. And yeah, it still looks like paint and it still behaves like paint. I think the Army Painter Silver Metallic has thickened up a little, but it's still working fine. Here's a goblin painted after 3 freeze-thaw cycles. No better and no worse than the benchmark minis. I kept going for a total of 7 freeze-thaw cycles. I put these veteran paints onto the palette, and it looks like they're still holding up pretty well. We'll paint a wizard dude from Arcadia Quest to make sure. Okay, so when paint is designed, there's a whole list of attributes that need to be optimized. Color, pigmentation, consistency, flow, coverage, sheen, chemical durability, mechanical durability, light fastness, material availability, material safety, price, and probably some other stuff. Optimizing all of those qualities involves a series of trade-offs. Freeze protection for the paint is an attribute that doesn't matter at all until it matters a whole heck of a lot. Most of the paints that I grabbed for this test have passed with flying colors. I wouldn't store them in the trunk of your car during the winter, but if they happen to freeze once or twice during shipping, you'll probably be okay. Now let's get back to the failure. After only one freeze, the green skin from Army Painter became completely unusable. I'm sensing weakness. Let's freeze some more bottles of Warpaint Fanatic. These exact bottles appeared on my channel a year ago and painted up some pretty nice models. I've kept them at room temperature since then, but now it's time to face the cold. After the first freeze and thaw, there was definitely some damage. Not catastrophic in the same way as that bottle of green, but there's definitely been some degradation. Chunks are forming in several of the colors, and there's some separation of the solids from the liquid carrier. So this isn't good news for the Army Painter, but it is good news for us. I'm glad that we have some examples here of the types of failure that can occur when paint freezes. I've heard that frozen paints can have a cottage cheese texture, and I think we're starting to see a bit of that here. Years ago, I bought some old-style Vallejo game color out of a bargain bin in a Wisconsin hobby shop, and some of the bottles had a similar chunky texture. Now I understand why they might have had that texture, and why they might have been in that bargain bin. Okay, let's give these war paints a second freeze-thaw cycle. After the second cycle, the damage is more exaggerated.
Oh, no.
No. No. The red and yellow are complete trash now. Solid chunks swirling around in a clear liquid. The white paint isn't looking very good either. The blue is looking thick and chunky now, too. The gold and the brown are better, but they aren't quite what they used to be. Enough chit-chat, let's break out the microscope. These are glass slides sitting on top of the black base of the microscope, and they're lit from above. Some of what we're seeing are direct reflections from the lights. I'll compare some of these colors that went through 2 freeze cycles to brand new bottles of paint. I'm using a pin to stir things up and as a size reference. Okay, so acrylic paint is a mixture of color pigment, plastic binder, and a liquid carrier. After it's painted onto something, the liquid evaporates, leaving behind chunks of pigment embedded in a film of the plastic binder. The pigment gives the color, and the plastic binder gives the adhesion, durability, and sheen. The magic comes in getting the blend just right. In addition to the 3 major components, additives are used to fine-tune things. Defoamers, deodorants, stabilizers, plasticizers, matting agents, and yes, antifreeze. Some of these additives will dissolve into the water or whatever the carrier liquid is, but the main ingredients of the resin polymer binder and the pigments are not dissolved. They're just jumbled up in a delicate and ultimately temporary suspension or emulsion. Freezing can mess with this emulsion. When water freezes, the molecules crystallize into an ordered structure which is energetically favored. I think when some of these paints froze, some of the water molecules became aggregated with each other and became less mixed with the dispersed solids in the emulsion. Forming and maintaining suspensions isn't easy. Once the carrier liquid has separated from the polymer resins, the solids can start to aggregate with each other. It might not be possible to reverse the aggregation process, at least not at home just by shaking things. In broad terms, I think that's what we're seeing here. The smooth, even suspension of the paint has separated, and the solids have aggregated with each other. The chains of polymer resin are tangled and bound with each other, and now we have chunks. There are a couple of lessons here. The first is that yes, sometimes paint can be ruined by the cold. Some paint has good freeze protection and some does not. Be mindful about where you store your paint, and depending on where you live, be aware of the risks of ordering paint during the winter. The other takeaway is that it's hard to make good paint. A ton of expertise goes into making paint, and there's a whole lot of attributes that need to be fine-tuned, and this involves making trade-offs. I wanted to get a manufacturer's point of view, so I invited Greg from TurboDork to talk about how paint companies think about all of this.
Hi everyone, my name is Greg and I am the creator of TurboDork. Brent asked me on today to talk about what it's like to be a paint manufacturer who's had to reformulate around this freezing issue. And you may have encountered it yourself if you lived in a cold area and had some of our first formula paints. And to that I say I'm sorry, please email us and I'm happy to replace those paints with new remix formula ones. But anyways, so some history on the acrylic paint industry is that actually most acrylic paints have little to no freeze protection. And that's because most of the acrylic paint industry is house paint. The industry calls it architectural paint, but it's house paint. It's designed to be super cheap, have a lot of fillers, because you're trying to cover a large area with really thick coats. And their trade-off is to get that, they don't build in freeze protection because the idea is that you're buying the paint from like a Home Depot or Lowe's and you're using it within a few days. You're not storing it on a shelf for 4 years down the line when you come up with a project for it. That having been said, for our industry, which is the retail paint industry, we have different design considerations. So TurboDork paints were originally designed to have kind of a solvent style feel. I wanted something that was hard and glossy, had high optical clarity so that you could really see our metallics well, and then had what they call good pigment orientation, which is that as the paint dries, the metallic flakes all kind of come together as a single sheen, single coat for a good sheen. And we did that, but I had not built in freeze protection originally, partially because honestly, TurboDork just kind of exploded and grew a lot more than I ever thought it would. And we found out after a couple of years of shipping paints around, and more specifically when our distributors and retailers were shipping paints during the winter outside of our control, that it was going to become an issue. So that spawned a 2 years kind of behind the scenes reformulation of things where I went to Cal Poly and talked to some of their professors to tweak our formula to bring in what we ended up with, which is 4 freeze-thaw cycles that our paint can survive through. We went with 4 because it would cover our paints during shipping. So if the paint's on a shipping container, a couple times, or on a plane a couple times, or in a truck a couple times, it's totally fine. So it'll make it to a store, it'll make it to your doorstep, and then onto your hobby shelf and be fine. What it doesn't account for is something like, being stored in an unheated garage, or if it's in your car overnight for, a week, that kind of thing during the winter. But I think that was fine because most of our issues were during shipping. The funny thing is we actually were able to tweak that formula at the same time to make it better for people who hand brush with our paints. So traditionally when you're formulating something in acrylics, there's certain trade-offs. We had to give up a little bit of the hard glossy feel, but our paints became a little more elastic, which was better for hand brushing. And we also slowed down the drying process, so there's a little more open time. And they self-level a little bit better. And those are technically trade-offs from our original formula, but they actually made the paint better. And that's one of those things that we kind of found out that the way that you guys use paint is different than the way I thought we would originally use paint. And we just found that out through going to conventions and talking with everybody, and we're able to incorporate all that into the reformulation. Anyways, that's sort of an oversimplification of how things worked. Because the reality is changing a formula midstream for a small company, even like ours, it was quite a logistics nightmare. But it's worth tackling, because I feel like if we can make better paint, and especially if we can make paint that lasts longer and causes less customer service issues, we absolutely should. Like it's our duty of care to our customers. And when it kind of comes down to it, freeze protection is an unsexy thing to design for. But the reality is our hobby does a lot of its hobbying during the winter, and it became essential for us to work it into our paints. And yeah, I think that's about it Thanks. Back over to you, Brent.
Cool. Thanks, Greg. A lot of skill goes into making paint, and there are definitely some trade-offs that occur. In day-to-day use, freeze protection doesn't matter, but when it does matter, it really does matter. Hopefully this isn't an issue that you run into often, but I think it's interesting and useful to be aware of. Alrighty, that's all I've got for this time. Thanks so much for watching.